evening. I'm Marvin Kalb, Director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, and it's my pleasure, indeed my honor, to welcome you to the annual Theodore H. White Lecture. The lecture is tonight, and our follow-up seminar, is tomorrow morning. It was in 1989 that friends of journalist and writer Theodore H. White, one of the exceptional products of Harvard, endowed this lecture series. The effort was spearheaded by his friend Blair Clark, also a journalist and a former network executive. From the beginning, year after year, our speakers, including among others Walter Cronkite and Ben Bradley, have explored the role of the press and television in fashioning our politics and formulating our public policy. Teddy White was one of the preeminent journalists of his time. His first book, Thunder Out of China, co-authored with Annalee Jacoby, opened our eyes to the potential of Mao's revolutionary forces. His next book, Fire in the Ashes, explained the confusion and excitement of post-World War II Europe. And then, when White turned his attention to American politics with his groundbreaking series of campaign books called The Making of the President, he introduced a new kind of political coverage. The reporter as eyes and ears on every aspect of a presidential campaign. In his books and articles, not only was the major speech covered, but every backstage battle leading up to the major speech. Who was up, who was down at crucial stages of the campaign, personal vendettas, marital strains, even gossip went along with exhaustive legwork. By the mid-1970s, White himself realized that his books had had such a major impact on political journalism that, ironically, the American people were being shortchanged. Too much emphasis on what proved to be trivial, too little on what was truly substantive. We are still living with that unhappy legacy as we try to understand the new political currents running through this country. Tonight, I'm happy to say, we hear from one of the founding voices of modern American conservative thought, that of William F. Buckley, Jr., once of a place called Yale. Normally, I would introduce him as I've introduced other lecturers in the past, but tonight I have a better idea. I have asked the esteemed John Kenneth Galbraith, the Paul M. Warburg Professor of Economics Emeritus at Harvard, to do the honors. Not because Professor Galbraith agrees with Mr. Buckley's political philosophy and is here to praise him and it, but rather because he has spent so much of his long, fruitful, and exemplary life fighting against Mr. Buckley's conservatism. Indeed, the Galbraith-Buckley wars have raged playfully at dinner parties, humorously and elegantly at public forums for quite a few years. So for the latest chapter, I call on Professor Galbraith, who will, in his own inimitable style, introduce the Theodore H. White Lecturer for this year, William Buckley, Jr.
I need hardly say how pleasant it is for me to be here this evening with Catherine Galbraith, and I must also say with Pat Buckley, who has made the journey from New York with Bill to honor us on this occasion. Pat, we love you very much. Let me also just say a word, too, about the man who we honor tonight for his contribution to journalism, Teddy White. A personal word. When I arrived in the 1930s at Harvard, there was wonderfully a shortage of economists for teaching the elementary course. So I was put immediately in charge of a section where my star student was Teddy White. He was my favorite student for all that year. The next year I moved to Winthrop House, and my first thought was to get him to come to Winthrop House so I could be his tutor. And so I arranged one day to be on the admissions committee that then sat on applicants, and arranged also, in an impartial way, for Teddy to apply that day. He applied, and after some thought, I admitted him. And then I ran against the nature of Harvard in those primitive days. I was told by those really in charge that we had a full complement of the proletariat and could not have any more. Teddy came, as you know, from South Boston. So, much to my sorrow, I must say I really was angry about it. My admission was revoked, and he had to move, I think it was to Lowell House or some other inferior quarter. I then came to know Theodore White in later years, where we were both members of the staff of Time Incorporated before the great days of Time Warner, when it was still an institution with some personality. And later, of course, in the 1960 campaign, where I was traveling with Adlai Stevenson, and he was writing the book, which correctly, I think, seriously damaged the whole concept of the presidential campaign and turned it, the primary campaign, and turned it into something of a show business and something of a circus. I share your regret. And now, not reluctantly, I come to Bill Buckley. He's a wonderful person, lovable friend, generous, thoughtful, a marvelous conversationalist. I've said many times that the wonderful thing about Bill Buckley is the qualities that you so much enjoy as long as you can keep him off of politics. Oh, did I make a mistake there? Bill Buckley has been my friend, a family friend now, for 30 years and more. We have been, we have debated, we have, most of all, joined together as fellow skiers. I remember the one time when politics intervened in our otherwise in our enjoyment of skiing. It was a spring day in Switzerland. The ski runs were very bad. Bill accomplished the run with competence, I with great difficulty. As we joined eventually at the bottom of the ski slope, Bill said, "How long have you been skiing, Ken?" I wasn't going to give him anything at all. I said, "Oh, about 30 years." He said, "Same length of time you have been studying economics." There was that one other occasion, Bill, when I was leaving Switzerland to go to Russia, then the Soviet Union. And Bill said to me, "What are you going to do in that country?" And I straightened up and said, "I'm going to give some lectures." And he said, "What do you have left to teach them?" There's nothing that gives one more enjoyment than introducing Bill Buckley, because one knows that the longer one speaks, the greater limit he places on Bill's doctrine. But I'm going to be tolerant. I only have one final suggestion. At one juncture this evening, I was asked to be moderator, and I said that I couldn't, because moderation is not possible when Bill Buckley is here. Bill, I give way reluctantly to you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Galbraith, Mr. Kalb, Mr. Shorenstein. I note from material so thoughtfully sent to me by Mr. Kalb that my predecessors introduced their talks where such a link existed. By recalling personal experiences with Theodore White, I happily do as much because we were good friends. I met him first in the fall of 1965. He had been commissioned by Life magazine to do a piece on the mayoralty campaign in New York in which I contended. I say contended, though it never crossed anyone's mind, let alone my own, that I might actually become the mayor. My purpose was entirely didactic, which is to say, to take advantage of the attention the press would need to pay to my campaign for the purpose of propagating my views on sound municipal government, which views were news-breakingly sensational in New York City then as they would be now. Considerable attention was given to what I said as it was progressively acknowledged that the contest between the Democrat and the Republican would probably turn on the size of the vote for the Conservative. Sitting in my little office, Teddy White scribbled in his notebook with that total absorption for which he was noted my replies to his questions. At one point I introduced some levity. He raised his hand, a rabbi's calm demurral. "Wait," he said. "Wait for that. We can become friends later at lunch." The next hour it's all business. Not many years later, a little club materialized in New York City. Its membership limited to 6 people. It had a single function, namely to convene for lunch every 6 weeks or so. I think we were rather heady with the power we exercised. Teddy White was demonstrably the most sought-after journalist in America. Oz Elliott ran Newsweek. Abe Rosenthal ran the New York Times. Irving Kristol ran the Neocons. Dick Clermont ran the correspondence of Time magazine. John Chancellor ran NBC News, and of course I owned the conservative movement. We really did have a wonderful time, among other things, exchanging any number of professional intimacies without any fear of a leak. It was at one of these lunches in January of 1972 that Teddy described with feverish anticipation the forthcoming trip to China of President Nixon. He had applied, he told us, for one of the 85 seats reserved for journalists, and he was confident, though in expounding that confidence he betrayed his apprehension, that given his distinctive history as a China specialist, he would receive favorable consideration in his bid for one of the most coveted slots in modern journalism. I responded that, prompted by his enthusiasm, I too would apply to the White House. Teddy White paused, his eyebrows furrowed. He stared over at me, brandishing contingent fear and loathing. "Buckley," he said, "if you're on that plane and I am not, I will never talk to you again." We were both not only on that press plane, but seated together. Teddy White was Buddha happy. He had a bulging satchel load of books and magazine articles and clippings he worked over on those long, long airplane legs, Washington to Hawaii, then to Guam, then to Shanghai, then to Peking. From his pile, he would from time to time pluck out an anti-red Chinese tidbit. and offered to me playfully in return for anything favorable to the Red Chinese, I might supply him from my own pile gentleman's agreement. Now he beamed, "I have a clip here that says the Red Chinese have killed 34 million people since they took over China. What will you offer me for that?" I foraged among my material and triumphantly came up with a clip that said the Red Chinese had reduced illiteracy from 80% to 20%. But White scoffed me down like a professional pawn shop broker. "Hell," he said, "I have that one already. Everybody has that one." I scrounged about for more pro-Chinese communist data and finally told him disconsolate that I could not find one more item to barter for his plum. He smiled contentedly at this tactical victory, but I remember wondering whether in fact he had lost the war. Books have been written about what happened in the ensuing 10 days. I wrote 10 columns and a long essay for Playboy magazine. I recall as a footnote relevant under present auspices that before that issue of the magazine appeared in the streets, I adapted the article to give it as a speech before what had been described to me as a small seminar at the Kennedy School here at Harvard. That seminar, by the time word had got around, became a lecture to over 1,000 students. One more triumph for the free market. Teddy White came to grips with his disappointments, which in subsequent books he examined and re-examined with a conscientiousness that approached scrupulosity. But always he engaged the reader's attention by his total commitment to the narrative excitement of what he was writing, dramatized by his sense of theater, and radiant with his concern for the language. The Chinese experience in 1972 is useful in giving perspective to my thoughts on the curious underperformance of the press and the bearing of these shortcomings on public matters. Some years ago, I gave to Professor Galbraith to read the draft of an essay I was writing for Foreign Affairs on human rights and public policy. He advised me, with that ambiguity for which he is renowned, to put my conclusion up front in the manner of the scholarly essay. Given that he has been so kind as to officiate over this assembly tonight and to give me shelter tonight when I am done, I oblige him here by saying up front that it is my premise that the politics of our free society suffer from the failure of the media to announce verifiable conclusions. Announce is perhaps not exactly the word I want. Sustain such conclusions is better, even better, the media's failure to correct factually incorrect perceptions. I say the Nixon trip to China gives us perspective. I was especially struck by an episode in Shanghai the day after we arrived. The banquet at the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square was hugely impressive, and the exuberance of President Nixon was such that following his after-dinner toast, he raised his liqueur glass and circled the table, bowing one after another to every one of the 12 men and women who shared with him Zhou Enlai's table. I remembered my dispatch that evening remarking that Richard Nixon's enthusiasm was at so high a pitch he'd have embraced Alger Hiss if he had been seated at that table. The following day, those of us who selected the academic option, our Chinese schedulers gave us 3 or 4 daily choices of what to do to instruct ourselves in the regime of Mao Zedong, were seated in the office of the rector of the University of Peking to learn about university life under the revolutionary government. At either end of the silver-haired rector, a scholar in his early 70s, stood a brachycephalic Red Guard, age perhaps 20, 22, their faces grimly construed to suppress any temptation to geniality. The rector was addressing us in Chinese, his words simultaneously interpreted by an official standing behind him. After a moment or two, John Chancellor motioned to me and to Teddy White. He whispered, "I sat next to that guy last night. He speaks perfect English. He got his Ph.D. in chemistry from the University of Chicago." It transpired that the Red Guards were in effective control of the entire university system, and they had forbidden the rector to speak to us in English because they did not themselves understand English, and therefore weren't equipped to intercept any ideological error by the chancellor of their university. This way, by hearing the words in Chinese, with a mere flick of the wrist, one or both could motion to the translator, interdicting heresy or inchoate heresy. Later that morning, after surveying the ravaged university library, Teddy said to me, "The most unpretentious college in America with a China department could not make do with a library as sparse as this one." Teddy White, the China specialist, was astonished by the lengths to which the Cultural Revolution had gone. The China of Owen Lattimore had been widely accepted as the flower of Chinese culture. The most widely read essays on contemporary China, devoured by every one of the journalists who traveled there in February of 1972, had been published in 2 succeeding issues of the Atlantic Monthly. Professor Ross Terrell described life in China, subsuming everything he saw in his reverie. He had concluded by asking, "Is China free?" and answering, "But there is no objective measure of the freedom of a whole society. At one point, we and China face the same value judgment. Which gets priority, the individual's freedom or the relationships of the whole society? Which unit is to be taken, the nation, trade union, our class, my cronies, me? This is the hinge on which the whole issue turns." He gave the example of the writer Kuo-mojo, who before liberation used to satisfy himself by writing books suited to his own taste for small audiences. Mao's government decided he should appeal to wider audiences. The writer, Mr. Terrell explained, cannot now do books for 3,000 or at most 8,000 readers, as Kuo used to do in Shanghai in the 1930s, but must write for the mass millions, and he's judged by whether he can do that well or not. Is that wrong? Now in the office of the rector of the University of Peking, we had direct experience of what Professor Terrell had called the hinge on which the whole issue turns. Yes, of course, we all acknowledge that ideology impinges upon the press and even on scholarship. But I am on my way to a different but related point, which is that the politics of a free society, specifically our own, are influenced, sometimes even dominated, by impressions either created by a headstrong press or tolerated by an indifferent or collusive press, and that the result of this under-education is that self-government is what? Led astray, corrupted, traduced. Let me move, so to speak, to the other end of the inquiry, the political end. Some time ago, I came across an observation by a journalist, as it happens, to the effect that Great Britain is in several respects other than self-governing. He mentioned capital punishment. Capital punishment, hanging in the British tradition, was abolished in 1965, notwithstanding that the polls established that the practice was approved of by over 70% of Britons. Public support for capital punishment that continues to this day. It was the point of the journalist who raised the subject that members of Parliament, in this instance, dominated by the sentiments on the subject of capital punishment of Oxbridge, and for this reason capital punishment could not be restored. We deduce, along with the lonely British editorialist, that in respect of penology, Great Britain cannot lay claim to self-government. What interests me less than the future of capital punishment in England, which interests me not at all, is how to frame an explanation of this anomaly. Let us suppose that Parliament, over the last 30 years, quite simply understands itself as resisting mobocratic bloodlust. What draws attention is that I have never seen attention paid to this anomaly, save in that one editorial. It is exactly that, an anomaly, most graphically expressed in the syllogistic mode. 1, the British people are self-governing. 2, the British people wish to restore capital punishment. 3, capital punishment is nevertheless denied, whence we are required to shorten the pants of the major proposition, which now reads, the people of England are in some respects self-governing, or perhaps the people of England are self-governing for so long as they have the impression that they are self-governing. An amplification of this modifier would have you say it is appropriate when the Parliament chooses to defy the will of the people to distract attention from what it is that they are doing. If the subject is brought up, change the subject. If you don't succeed, temporize. A democratic hygiene, one would suppose, suffers from such impurities. The tablet keepers might be expected to speak out demandingly, saying such a thing as, "This is outrageous. The people want penological reform, and Parliament refuses to give it to them." A calmer way for the defenders of democratic rectitude to proceed would be to say, go ahead, go public with this business, but Parliament has the obligation to acknowledge the default. It should declare in a public manifesto that the people of England, in respect of capital punishment, are uncouth, that the people desire of their representatives something their representatives cannot oblige them with, given that they are guided by more learned counsels than those of the people, that they are blessed with a moral vision more foreseeing, and that therefore Parliament must respectfully decline to reinstitute capital punishment. Edmund Burke and John Quincy Adams spoke such language, and the electorate accepted the trade-off. This hasn't been done by Parliament, not explicitly, and the press is acquiescent. Here is a relatively recent, and in the context I speak of utterly unnoticed, example back here in the United States of the phenomenon of press and politics passing each other on opposite sides of the street. This has to do with candidate Clinton, subsequently President Clinton, and the national election of 1992. Very soon after Mr. Clinton's inauguration, the New York Times published a series of articles by its Washington correspondent, David Rosenbaum. He undertook to give the reader what Mr. Rosenbaum called the push and pull over taxes. In the introductory piece, Mr. Rosenbaum wrote, "One popular misconception is that the Republican tax cuts caused the crippling federal deficit. The fact is the large deficit resulted because the government vastly increased what it spent each year, while tax revenues changed little." You will have surmised that my question is, why was there a popular misconception in this matter? How is it that the truth about the real economic picture of the 80s in the spring of 1993, so routinely now reported on by the New York Times, was so very different from what the American people were led to believe was true during the campaign and after that in the debate on the 1993 budget bill? The misperceptions go on. What about public spending on the infrastructure under Reagan-Bush? In Newsweek magazine, early in March of 1993, we read economist Robert Samuelson, and he told us, quote, "Clinton's basic rationale for more government is that investment in America has lagged. Actually, that isn't the case." What? How so? He went on, "Business investment has risen in every decade since World War II. In the 1980s, it averaged 11.5% of gross domestic product, up from 10.5 in the 70s, 9.5 in the 60s, 8.9 in the 50s. Research and development spending by business, government, and universities jumped dramatically in the 80s. The increase was 52% compared with only 12% in the 70s. Even government investment has revived somewhat. Since 1980, highway spending, adjusted for inflation, has risen about a quarter. Contrary to popular impression, road conditions have gradually improved. Between 1983 and 1991, the share of urban interstate highways rated as poor dropped from 17 to 8%. You will have surmised, again, that I wonder that the press declines a responsibility to illuminate that which is knowable in public controversy, and to maintain that spotlight on that which is known when there are indications that the shadows of ignorance or of obfuscation threaten. Many years ago, I wrote a book, the subtitle of which was The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. In it, I deliberated on what is now pretty generally classified and widely tolerated as epistemological pessimism, the position that nothing is truly knowable. The premise of academic freedom back in the 50s was that all ideas should be permitted to start even in the race, to use the phrase of Professor William Hurd Kirkpatrick of the Columbia School of Education. His position can be said to have stood on the shoulders of John Stuart Mill, who of course instructed us that no question can be deemed to be closed so long as a single person dissents from it. One supposes that deconstructionism is the apotheosis of this line of humble reasoning, which is, of course, that purposive reason is an intellectual conceit, a position that, in many forms, flowers everywhere, as among the jurors who freed O.J. Simpson. No scholar will underwrite the superstition that raising the minimum wage will raise the effective income of those the measure seeks to help without lowering the income of others. How does the press react? How should it react to statements by politicians who go about denouncing the minimum wage as unacceptable in modern circumstances? It isn't a matter of conjecture, but of established knowledge that when taxes are raised and lowered, people will manage their economic lives differently. Yet we continue to countenance economic projections based on static models. We know that inflation has devalued what might, but for inflation, have been capital gains, but much of the press is given to a nonchalant silence when arguments against a capital gains tax cut are advanced in the context of fairness. If it was knowable that the Maoists totally eliminated freedom in the Chinese Academy, that the British view on penology is routinely defied by Parliament in the 80s, that spending and taxes and public investment moved differently from how the public was led to believe they did, why were all these facts not universally known? Public ignorance in these matters happened because less than the truth suits the political strategies of ambitious office seekers who rely on a press willing, given congenial ideological circumstances, to defer noticing such anomalies and widely accepted misconceptions, perhaps indefinitely, as in the People versus the Parliament on the matter of capital punishment. The alternative here was for the press to accept responsibility to inform the public on what is really going on, and not merely to inform it, but to keep it informed, which is the equivalent of focusing on publicly ventilated misrepresentations as required, as often as it is required, to dispel encroaching ignorance. On behalf of the Brookings Institution, John E. Chubb and Terry M. Moe, respectively a senior Brookings Fellow and a political science professor at Stanford, conducted a rigorous statistical analysis of a massive schools and students database. They reached the conclusion 2 years ago that school choice is essential to the improvement of high school students' standardized test scores. The great lobby on the other side, the teachers' unions, is just that, a lobby so successful at the expense of relative American illiteracy. Why is such a lobby safe from relentless public exposure? And, of course, the voucher question brushes up against a constitutional interpretation, most conspicuously against the engulfing interpretation of the religion clause as forbidding any grant in aid to religious schools. Professor Eugene Genovese is a historian and political scientist of some distinction, in political sympathies a socialist. In a recent essay, he remarked in passing on what he called the monstrous rulings of the court at the expense of the freedom of the community to specify the nature of religious instruction in the local public school. Ad hoc, we get away with it. In Brooklyn, the schools close for Yom Kippur. Here and there, they close on Good Friday. But such freedoms are exercised in constant fear of judicial intervention. The ministers, priests, and rabbis of New York City combined 35 years ago to formulate a prayer which in their judgment was free of any denominational opportunism. That prayer, devised by religious leaders, deputized to undertake that function by the men and women whose children attended and attend New York City's public schools, was struck down by the court as constituting an encroachment on the separation of church and state. The court was not quite willing, in Engel versus Vitale, to opine that the saying of that prayer itself constituted the union of church and state. Rather, it relied, as most of the court's votaries continued to do, on the slippery slope argument that if you admit common prayer, or, as we would subsequently see, the exposure of the Ten Commandments on a school wall, you are risking a loss of constitutional gravity, auguring freefall into the arms of theocracy. Now, all this reasoning appears to me an assault on self-government that the press condones because the anti-religious sanctions appeal to secularist sensibilities. Probing the question with Mr. Ira Glasser of the American Civil Liberties Union, I recently volunteered to make a major subscription to his organization if he would submit to a truth test that documented his genuine fear that the restoration of common prayer would risk the advent of a theocratic state. He laughed and changed the subject, but I knew that he was I knew that he was crying in the inside. Why does the press play dead on this point, or is it hypnotized? And if so, on what else is it hypnotized? And does it lose any sleep over the spurious concern given to theocratic hobgoblins? Or, like Harry Truman after he ordered the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima, does it simply turn in for a good night's sleep? The list of public misperceptions is pretty long. In October, grown senators and congressmen, including one or two who had served as college professors, including one who served here as a college professor, were describing the proposed tax bill as a, quote, rip-off for the advantage of the rich. Let us suppose that every penny of the proposed capital gains tax reductions would flow only to the rich. Never mind that it isn't so. Even then, capital gains tax reductions account for 25% of the proposed tax reduction, so that the defensible way to communicate one's opposition to the bill would be, quote, 1/4 of the tax reductions will flow to the rich, who are the predatory class. It has been established beyond serious debate that economic forecasts done on static models do not tell us what's going to happen. So then why are such forecasts treated as extrapolations? I'll rephrase that. Politicians will take any provision they dislike in any bill and proceed to condemn the whole of it. My question isn't how do you get politicians to stop doing that kind of thing, because that enterprise requires reshaping human nature. But I wonder why the press doesn't require the politician to confront his distortions. In 1950, Senator Robert A. Taft, the primary sponsor of the Taft-Hartley bill, passed that year and universally denounced by labor leaders and many Democrats as the Slave Labor Act, ran for re-election in Ohio. His agents quietly distributed a poll among a valid sample of labor union members, itemizing a number of measures regulating union activity. The questionnaire asked which of those measures were approved by the union member filling out the form. The experiment established that 14 of the 17 provisions of the Taft-Hartley slave labor bill were popular with 80% of the slave laborers of the state of Ohio. But it was Senator Taft who brought that off, not Hearst or Scrip Howard or UP. A healthy politics is one in which the rights of the individual are assured, following which the mores of a free people are given legal sanction as required, less than that but palpable social sanction, as prompted, one would hope, by virtuous and libertarian public inclinations. But defensible self-government presupposes knowledge at various degrees of intimacy of what the public question is and how it is proposed to deal with it. The dissemination of this knowledge, of course, is primarily the function of the press, which one supposes is the reason Jefferson once said he'd take a free press over government if the choice had to be made. It is a mad, current passion to increase the size of the vote. We now receive a voter registration card when applying for a driver's license, which application the applicant need not demonstrate his ability to read. This is a fetishistic extension of the democratic argument. Voting is a civil sacrament, and to vote thoughtlessly is to blaspheme. It used to be that a voter needed to prove his literacy in English. First, they, the trendsetters, dropped the need for literacy, subsequently the need for English. We're asked to assume that the vote is the important thing, not the information required to inform that vote. But information, of course, is not enough. I repeat it here only because to fail to do so in the context of my analysis will seem strange to those who have heard it. What I wrote 30 years ago, pleading the case for political judgment as needed to supplement sheer knowledge, was that I would sooner be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty of Harvard. But for all the delinquencies of the press, there is out there a hard, inquisitive intelligence. 7 years ago, I met with Professor Galbraith on schedule on the Today Show, the morning after the election of 1988, in which the Democratic challenger from Massachusetts received only the electoral vote of Massachusetts. Mr. Bryant Gumbel asked my reaction to the returns, and I said that the vote in Massachusetts had perhaps established that there is, after all, a need for federal aid to education. Mr. Galbraith interposed to remark that Massachusetts has always prided itself on being ahead of the general political culture. Belatedly, I defer to Professor Galbraith's tribute. Yesterday, Governor Weld of Massachusetts proposed abolishing most state agencies here to effect a $650 million saving. Those he would not eliminate, he would privatize. He was acting on recommendations made by individual citizens who had, at his invitation, filed their recommendations. The moment is clearly at hand to thank Mr. Galbraith first for his courtesies tonight, even as I thank you for yours, and then to congratulate him on his residence in the proud state in which the culture of our Mayflower forefathers has given us one more bloom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buckley. As I warned you, there is an opportunity now for questions. And just to point out the obvious, there are microphones here and up above. If you have a question, please come to the microphone now. When you ask a question and identify yourself when you do so. And I would call upon Professor Galbraith, who I know would like to ask the first question. The microphone is right there, Professor.
In the tradition of this distinguished school, questions, Bill, are very rarely followed by a question mark. usually by an exclamation mark. I have two observations which I will put in the form of a question. One is really a serious question. I rejoice, as did so many others, on your comment following that mayoralty election in New York, when you said that if elected, your first action would be to ask for a recount. This appealed to me deeply, as I know it did to the people of New York. My second one is a question. You, tonight, as so often before, have aligned yourself strongly against the social and public responsibilities of the state. Most recently, your applause for Governor Weld. For many years, Catherine Galbraith and I have been devoted television viewers of Firing Line, really one of the great educational enterprises of all time. Bill, where do you stand on public television?
Well, to comment first on the matter of the mayoralty election, it is true that I inadvertently made that remark and hurt a few people's feelings. They were very pleased to remind me ever since that I got only 13% of the vote, so this wasn't in prospect. Actually, I consider 13% of the vote dangerously large. And it was then that I said if I ran again, my slogan would be voting by invitation only. On the matter of Firing Line, it receives no subsidy whatever, and I've simply wondered at the prevailing notion that the subsidy provided by Washington, which means the subsidy by which Washington receives money from Massachusetts in order to return to Massachusetts, is really required. I don't know what the statistics are in Boston, but I know what they are in San Francisco. 4% of the expenses of public broadcasting are sustained by the government, the balance by the people. I've always been astonished by the apparent innocence of what has always struck me as an elementary analytical perspective. The 50% of the taxpayers pay 95% of all taxes, so that when we instruct Washington to administer a social program, we are instructing Washington to turn around and tax us to do it. I see no other explanation for it. Under the circumstances, we are asking for auto-taxation, raising the question, why don't we simply give it ourselves in the first instance? Because any dollar that goes to Washington spends an expensive night out on the town before it returns here. So I like to think that we didn't have to wait for Richard Nixon to start the National Endowment or the public television in order to certify that the people of Massachusetts would sustain their own public broadcasting station. Okay?
Nobody here. Is there anybody upstairs? Will you? Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Buckley. I need your help. As a very honest and earnest and revolutionary reporter, tomorrow morning my plan is, armed with your answer to my question, to revolutionize the U.S. media and make it the kind of press that you seem to be advocating, much more incisive and critical and honest. So the help I need is the answer to the question, given that there are some very admirable reporters out there, can you describe what you see as stopping these reporters from doing their job well on an individual basis? How is it that some of the individual reporters that you've known to be men of integrity and women of integrity have failed to make the media what you think it should be?
Who are you going to write that story for?
Just for myself. I have a little journal at home.
Oh, I see.
Well, I touched on possible motives. One was a general sense of acquiescence in the ideological objectives of the people about whom they underreport. A second is a certain sloth, and a third is a kind of a determinism, i.e., if I tell you that 2 + 2 = 4, and I hear you 2 days later saying that 2 + 2 = 5, I sort of give up on you. Those three, I think, do contribute. There's also, I think, an identity that a lot of reporters feel, which is an aspect of ideological affiliation. The other night, I saw a reference to Mr. Gingrich's defiant stand against President Clinton's threatened veto. It struck me that was not quite right, since he was representing a legislature of 470 people over against a single person who exercised the presidency. Wouldn't it have been okay to say resolute rather than defiant? Because defiance does suggest, does it not, a kind of a mutinous relationship. So all those factors add up. But actually, I'm sorry that you asked me to exactly describe those factors, because I have hoped that tonight and tomorrow I will hear from my Confederates explanations which for this underperformance, as I put it, that haven't already occurred to me. Perhaps there are others. I'm eager to hear what they are.
Was there ever a time when, in your view, the press performed well in this country?
Oh, there have been hundreds of times when they performed well. I remember the earthquake in Los Angeles. It was brilliantly covered. I think, Marvin, I have to ask you to focus that question on individual matters. Sometimes the underperformance of the press is because the press is simply misled. The principal Soviet reporter for the New York Times predicted early in 1960 that by 1970 the production of the Soviet Union would exceed that of the United States. I don't think Mr. Schwartz was by any means moved by ideological predispositions. He simply read the data in that way. He was egregiously wrong, but not, in my judgment, suborned by any ideological animus. One has to analyze these things as one goes. But I think it is correct. We know that 85% of the press voted Democratic 2 elections ago. The poll conducted by Mr. Lichtheim and his partner. So it is, I think, difficult entirely to conceal one's bias, and however strenuously the effort is made, it is not always successful. People being human, as most of you are.
Yes, please, your question.
Yes, Thad Williamson is the name. On the question of the media and public ignorance, I wonder why, at least to my knowledge, you and other conservatives have voiced relatively, if any, little concern on the documented and not particularly controversial complicity of institutions of the American state in the death of 150,000 persons carried out by the Guatemalan Army since 1980, for one example. Another would be 1/3 the population of East Timor dead since the Indonesian invasion in 1975. And I just wonder how you explain that and what you feel that the consequences might be if these were not matters of public ignorance.
Did you get that first one? On the Indonesian business, I think it was underreported. I think it is true that there was considerable exuberance over a situation in which communists were overthrown. What didn't receive sufficient attention was the cost of that counter-revolution, and especially the cost of the up to 200,000 people who were slaughtered in the course of that convulsion. It is widely reported that this was as a result of insufficient data reaching the press. Whether that was a satisfactory excuse, I simply don't know.
Question in the back.
Conservatives,
No, you first.
Conservatives don't always agree on foreign policy issues. I understand that Jack Kemp and Alphonse D'Amato were very much concerned about our policy toward Lithuania when George Bush was president and James Baker was Secretary of State. And Richard Nixon was very much concerned about the situation in Russia shortly before he died. Some people think the communists might win an election in Russia, and they think that the election might even be called off. How do you see the conservative role in foreign policy, particularly regarding Russia and East Europe?
Well, the post-Cold War conservative position on foreign policy has conceitedly not crystallized. There are tensions within the Republican Party, which are not all that different from the tensions one sees in the Democratic Party. Mr. Clinton, for instance, announced in 1993 that he would not extend the most favored nation consideration of China unless China manifestly followed a certain reforms which he proceeded to stipulate. A year later, he simply backed off on it because the pressures from Republicans and from Democrats were to the effect that whatever the timetable that would be most desired, it was simply unrealistic to impose it on China. Let China get along with its little acupunctures of capitalism, and see whether or not after a while the entire corpus was revived. But the conservatives have been, on the whole, over the last 40 years, mobilized on the proposition that the entire resources of the state, as required, were and ought to be available to guarantee the sovereignty of the country. Those conservatives, like those liberals, who wanted to charge after all errant communities in search of a magnification of human rights, did not dominate. John Quincy Adams, as you all recall, said in, I think, 1824 that the American people are friends of liberty everywhere, but custodians only of their own. For that reason, it was correct to mobilize all the resources of a nation to confront the Soviet Union, which was manifestly a danger to our own liberties, but not as a result of that franchise automatically authorizing us to enter Lithuania, or for that matter Somalia, or for that matter Haiti, however praiseworthy our motivations.
question from the balcony.
Yes. Hi, my name is Chris Maringer. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I recently read Dan Wakefield's book on New York in the 50s, in which you were referenced with some frequency. I was hoping you could comment. I was hoping you could comment on that era, and also perhaps on today's environment for young thinkers and writers.
Oh, no, I can't do that in a couple of sentences. I would wear you out.
How about a good story from New York in the 50s, then?
How about what? Well, in the 50s, in New York City, National Review was born. So that for that reason, there is a shrine appropriate to those quarters in Murray Hill in New York City. I've written a certain amount about the 50s. Unfortunately, I've written a certain amount about everything. But I can't. Dan Wakefield writes with the luxury of time and long meditative chapters in which he can recall this or the other episode. But it's really not appropriate to the telegraphic requirements of a public session. So if you will come and visit me, I'll chat with you as long as you can stand it, but without holding 500 people hostage.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Please.
There was in this past Sunday's Washington Post on the front page, which unfortunately costs $1.25 to buy up here, and if you can get it, and in several New England states not available at any price, an article about the state of the American daily newspapers today. We're talking about your premise of underreporting, non-reporting, and it was pointing out the decline in circulation and pointing out the kind of news that is appearing in our daily newspapers, and that the polls that the newspapers have taken show that the people are not interested in national news, they are not interested in world news. They're interested in a lot of the fluff. Now, do you agree that there is a decline in our newspapers as far as reporting on national and international matters? And if so, what do you forecast for the future about the state of the citizens' ability to know what is happening in our world if they are so interested?
Well, you know, Carlyle said that politics is the preoccupation of the quarter-educated. And I find that entirely appealing to the extent that one can skip the news. There's no reason not to do so. To the extent one needs to be informed of it, that is a civic obligation. It is true that newspapers have reduced circulations, and fewer newspapers are being published than was the case 35, 40 years ago. The reason for that is quite plain, namely that 70% of the American people get their news from television. They're perfectly satisfied to do with a half hour with Jennings or whoever, or now with CNN. But this, I don't think, answers the question whether the news that is published discharges the responsibility that I feel belongs to it. A poll just a year or so ago asked, by what are you primarily influenced? By the press or by politicians? Answer, 44% press, 22% politicians. So that most people think that the press sets the agenda. And I think they're probably correct in thinking that under the circumstances, to the extent that news does get through, it ought to be news that is aflame with a certain mission, insufficiently, as I have suggested tonight, discharged.
Our final question from the balcony, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Buckley. My name is Peter Weinman. I'm up here. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. In view of your critique of the media, I wonder what your view is of the impact on the country of the proliferation of right-wing media pundits and talk show hosts throughout the country?
Well, the proliferation of right-wing anything is good. I say that recognizing that it is a disarming question. I was asked, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago at Williams College, somebody got up and said, "What do you think of Rush Limbaugh?" So I said, well, I remember being in Madrid in 1970 when, of course, Franco was the total dictator, and hearing a wonderful story. It was about an intellectual who ran into another intellectual at a bar, and he tapped him on the shoulder and said, "What do you think of Franco?" And he said, "Well, follow me." So they tiptoed out of the bar, out of the barrier, across a great park, down to the side of a lake, got into a canoe, rowed out to the middle of the lake. He said, "I like him." I think that the proliferation of right-wing talk shows really has to do with a felt need to react to what is widely recognized as establishmentarian opinion. If you can't crank up opposition to the Washington Post or to the New York Times, then you find your little niches, either as a columnist or as a radio talk show host. Here, people can actually call in and say, "Look, isn't this bunk?" To which the host says, "Yes, it is bunk." And the sense of emancipation radiates in that exchange. So that's why I think that is happening. I'm terribly glad it is happening. I wouldn't for a second, obviously, condone any exchanges on radio anywhere that are cuckoo, but nobody has quoted any to me, at least from Mr. Limbaugh. So on the whole, I urge you to sleep peacefully.